yeah, I'm going to start at the beginning of the history of alcohol. And in doing so, I have to confess that I am in no way an expert on Sumerian, Mesopotamian culture or Egyptian culture or anything like that. I've looked up bits about alcohol, and over time I've picked up bits about other stuff, but I'm not going to claim to be an expert. I've, tried to get it right, but if I completely misunderstand something, that's because it really isn't my field. I'm just interested in alcohol. So there you go. So also the fact, of course, that we're going into a period about which not that much is known in some ways. The further back you go, the fewer jigsaw pieces you have to put together. We really can't say how long humans have been drinking alcohol for. After all, alcoholic things develop naturally. Fruit ferment, reindeer, caribou drinking alcohol, eating fermented fruit are a major hazard in Canada, apparently. So you have to imagine that people are, frequently eating fermented fruit and thinking, oh, that was quite nice, let's do that again when we can. Or possibly thinking, oh, my head, I don't understand what happened. One or the other. So, it would have been discovered multiple times and people would gradually work out how to try to do it deliberately. And the start of what developed into deliberate alcohol making goes back probably about 13,000 years-ish. Back to a point where people were harvesting wild grain. And this is before agriculture. This is Mesolithic cultures who are hunter-gatherers. One of the things they're gathering is grain because it's useful. And you can, given the right plants and the right climate, gather enough for that to be worth doing. And you're going to want to store it to keep it dry, and then you can, put it in your porridge or your stew, start to process it. But if some water gets into it and the conditions are just right, especially if it's been malted, which is to soak it till it starts to sprout, then it will quite probably start developing something resembling alcoholic porridge, fizzy alcoholic porridge. So the thing is here, beer predates farming, not the other way around. It's hard to say because obviously that's also pre-pottery, and you can't go looking for the remnants in vessels of things when none of the vessels survive. But there are some suggestive finds. There's some residues in some Israeli caves from about 11,000 BC. And there's an amazing place called Göbekli Tepe, I probably said that wrong, in Turkey from about 9,000 BC-ish. And it's a big gathering place made with big stone slabs. There's no proper roof or proper walls. There's no other buildings for a long way around, but it's clearly some sort of gathering site. And there are these huge stone tubs, about 40 gallons each, and they contain just a little trace of oxalate, which is something you get when you mix water and barley. Now, it's possible they just like to eat their barley soggy, but it's generally thought to be more likely that they are creating some sort of alcoholic substance, whether mostly solid or mostly liquid or somewhere sludgy in between. So what comes from this is the idea that actually farming wasn't invented so that we could have bread or so that we could have, our animals just on hand to grab out the fields. It was invented so that we could more easily make beer, because grains are the first cultivated crops, more or less, and it makes a lot of sense. If you've got a limited amount of grain, turning it into beer makes a lot of sense from their point of view. It's easier to make than bread. You don't need to heat anything up. It actually keeps your vitamin B in more readily, so it's healthier. And once you've stopped hunting, you're not getting as much of that from farming, from hunting as you were, so you need that. It keeps longer, it purifies the water to an extent, and it actually keeps a higher calorific value of the barley than turning it into bread does. So why wouldn't you turn the whole lot into beer? They probably learned fairly quickly that using the same tub over and over gives better results. And so brewers, it's thought, would sort of travel from community to community with their own mash tub as a sort of starter for it. If you don't do that, you have to do what some nomadic tribes still do to this day, which is to sort of chew on some of the grains and spit them in, because the enzymes in spit can start the process going as well. But from the earliest times, beer and civilization go hand in hand. At what point they stopped doing that is something we'll probably find further along the line, but at the time, very much beer was a marker of civilization. So the earliest literature we have, things like the Tale of Gilgamesh, which is about 4,000 years old, something like that. And it has, a part of the story there has a vineyard belonging to Siduri, who's known as an immortal tavern keeper, and female notably. In all of these stories, it's the women doing the brewing and the serving of beer. And Siduri uses the tree of life, the vine of life, to make a liquid of eternal life. But she didn't give it to just anyone. But she meets Enkidu, and Enkidu is sort of the original wild man who is humanized through being given food and beer. And the quote is something like, he ate the food until he was sated. Of the beer he drank 7 cups. His soul became free and cheerful. His heart rejoiced. His face glowed. He rubbed his hairy body. He anointed himself with oil. He became human. That's how important beer is. There's another story that's probably from about the same sort of date about the goddess Inanna and Enki, the god of wisdom. And the two of them sit and get drunk together. It goes something like Enki and Inanna drank beer together. They drank more beer together. They drank more and more beer together. With their bronze vessels filled to overflowing. With the vessels of Urash, mother of the earth, they toasted each other, they challenged each other. And Enki gets so drunk that he starts basically offering and giving things to Inanna. He said, I shall give her the high priesthood, godship, the enduring crown, the throne of kingship. He's just in that sort of mood. And basically he gives away to Inanna all of the pillars of civilization. And she accepts all of these, and eventually she sort of accepts the making of decisions for the gods, and then goes home, leaving Enki drunk, sitting there, and he gives her his blessing at the time, and then falls asleep. And he wakes up and says, where are all my things? What have I done? Where's my crown? Where's my godhood? Where's my beer? Where are all my things? And he goes and asks a chap called Izimud, and 14 times Enki says, where's my stuff? And Izimud said, yeah, you gave that to my daughter. And where's this? Yeah, you gave that to my daughter as well. That must have been some night. And Enki starts sending creatures to fetch all these things back. He sends things called the Enkum creatures and the Uru giants. But every time they get nearer, she gives a great scream and they flee away from her. And eventually she goes back to him and says, yeah, you did do that. So let's talk about this. I'm going to let mankind have access to all of these tools of civilization. You can have your godship back and things like that, and it'll all work out fine. Apparently she also brings him, quote, a lure and the art of women at this time. Not entirely sure what that is, could hazard a guess. There were a certain amount of vine growing at the same time as well. Probably on temple sites, though, and it's suggested that ordinary people would probably never get to drink any wine. And most of the places in that area would be either wine drinking or beer drinking, depending on which was more easy to grow. Makes sense. There was a wine goddess, Amagestin, Mother Vinestock, although increasingly she becomes a water goddess instead. There is also Pargestin Dug, who is the good Vinestock, who is a god, and he is married to a lady called Ninkasi, who is the lady of inebriating fruit. And she's supposed to be the one that knows how to actually make the beer. And her brew makes the liver happy, really, and fills the heart with joy. She again moves from wine to beer over time. And all her brothers and sisters seem to be alcohol related as well, in that they all seem to be sort of different stages of drunkenness. They're called things like beer, he of frightening speech, he of clear speech, he of eloquent speech, the mirthful one, the braggart, and the lord of the land. I'd like to see that as a sort of progression through one night, depending on how many pints you've had. The earliest instructions for making beer go back to about this date as well, about 4,000 years ago. And it's a beverage made from barley bread, basically. You steep it and ferment it. It's very simple. But this drink was very, very common, we know that. There's a proverb that goes right back to that time. He is fearful like a man unacquainted with beer. And we'd be pretty much unacquainted with it too if we met that kind of beer, if someone served it up to us in a pub. It's because the brewing process is so inefficient. It's very high in unfermented starch and very low in alcohol, which in practical terms means it's very thick and very gloopy, and there's sort of bits floating around in it. And the consequence of that is you'd actually drink it with a straw. So straws are not a modern fancy, cocktail thing. Straws go right back to the beginning of beer. And there are some lovely artworks of a group of people sharing from one big vat of beer, and they've all just got their own straw, and they're all sort of sitting on all sides of it with their long straws sucking it up. And that's obviously going to filter out the worst of your bits. And of course the straws at this point literally are straws. By the end of this period, probably that's more about culture than because you need it, because they have started improving their filtering system a bit. You get different kinds of beer coming in with names like dark or fresh or light or red brown, depending on characteristics of it. It seems that some of the early beer makers would have been definitely female and possibly have some association with Ninkasi and being priestesses of her. But increasingly, some people, it becomes a commercial venture, although again still for women, or it becomes an item of barter. And you start getting effectively ale houses, ale selling venues, which brew their beer on site, which is a very complicated process with lots of different vats, and we know the names for all the different vats, if not exactly what each one's used for. We know they told jokes. A few of them survive. They make virtually no sense to us now. For instance, one of them is, the dog gnawing on a bone says to his own anus, "This is going to hurt you." Sumerian humour. Though they drank, we know that prostitutes were frequently available. They'd be just outside the door generally. And we know that they sang songs because we have the lyrics for one of them. And it's all about those different brewing vats, and it's how we know their names. If I strip out all the repetition in it, and there's a lot because it's a drinking game, and you call and repeat, refrain. It goes something like, the Gukul vat, which makes sure that we're happy. The Lamsar vat, we're pleased with that, but the Gerbel jar is best by far, and so on. It's little rhyming couplets about all the different jars and how important they are in the making of the beer. And there's other verses, things like, if you spilled beer on the floor, you'll be happy forevermore. We'll live in peace and do just fine, for we love Ninkasi's beer and wine. It's not subtle. But the religious element of it there has gone from being kind of really serious to being a drinking song as part of the joke. So yeah, they'll be toasting to Ninkasi, but it's not a big sacred deal. It's not long after that you get proclamations saying thou shalt not enter a beer house because it's a den of vice. There's definitely not any religious connotation to the sexual aspect of it anymore. The Code of Hammurabi from 1770 BC has regulations about how alehouse keepers should behave, and things like them making very sure that outlaws don't gather in the place. If she doesn't arrest any outlaws that are gathering there, then she herself shall be put to death. So they're trying to keep them legit. And long-distance trade has begun in both ale and beer and wine. So there are tablets from this sort of date with things like, Amma acknowledges receiving from his brewer Alulu 5 zilla of best beer. And there's a letter from a Babylonian merchant to his agent saying, the boats have arrived here at the end of their journey at Sippar, but why have you not bought and sent me some good wine? Send me some and bring it to me in person within 10 days. The other place where in these really early times we can look quite closely at what's going on with their alcoholic customs is ancient Egypt. Now, obviously that's a very long time period, but some things do seem to stay constant within that. And we can certainly look at the beliefs that surround alcohol. So beer is said to have been discovered by Osiris, who left some water and sprouted grain alone and found that they had fermented. This is the most prosaic, miracle, godly discovery ever, because that's what some people actually did. It isn't that Osiris one day decided to create beer. Osiris accidentally made some and then thought, oh, that worked. It's marvellously prosaic, that. We don't know a lot about beer in early Egypt. We know that one pharaoh was buried with a lot of wine. We know that workers on the pyramids are paid partly in beer, which does make sense because it's liquid bread at this point. It's just as nutritious as the bread and not sufficiently high in alcohol that it's going to stop you getting on with your work. And some records of the town suggest that a day's ration for these workers was 3 loaves of bread and 8 pints of beer. Really boring, if nothing else. One team of workers working on the 3rd Giza pyramid described themselves in a bit of graffiti as the Drunkards of Menkaure, that being the name of the king that they're building a pyramid for. The tomb of Meketre, who is a prime minister, is buried with the most amazing little diorama of a brewery and bakery. And again, I'd absolutely suggest you go and look this up because it's the most amazing little, it's about this sort of size. And it's just little model figures, like little morph figures, sitting with little vats and little tools and grinding and so on. You can see the whole process in several stages. Proper little diorama. So the overseer with a baton sits inside the door. In the brewery, 2 women grind flour, which another man works into dough. After the second man treads the dough into mash in a tall vat, it's put into tall crocks to ferment, and after fermentation, it's poured off into round jugs with black clay stoppers. That's what to expect, but it's really neat. There are lots of varieties of beer. The favourite is called Heket and is flavoured with honey. That would be my favourite too. And it does seem to have been drunk by everybody. Even the lowest burials that we find in terms of social status tend to be buried with a small jar of beer. And it's also clear that they absolutely associated boozing and sex. There's a poem from ancient Egypt that says something like, give her dance and give her song, give her wine and ale that's strong, confuse her cunning, have her tonight, and she will say, dear, hold me tight. Before you think that this is a typical men getting women drunk scenario, there are also plenty of similar poems and the like in which it's the woman plying the man with drink, and it's clear that both sexes are drinking a lot, and both sexes have that association. Lots of late Egyptian beers have names like the Heavenly and the Joy Bringer. For women drinking, for instance, there's a painting with a bunch of men drinking and a bunch of women drinking on separate tables. And they've got about the same amount of booze in front of them each. And one of the women is saying, give me 18 jars of wine. I want to be drunk. My insides feel like straw. And the waiter figure in it says that he'll stay with them because it does appear that they're about to get so plastered that they're going to need some help. There are other tomb scenes even showing a sort of subsequent scene of a woman being sick and another woman holding her hair up. They seem to be quite proud of all of this. It's not a subject of shame at all. They do have wine as well as beer, as that suggests. It's always shown as red or dark in the pictures, but again, it's very much for the elite and for religious contexts because it's more expensive. And they start labelling their wine. So we start seeing something about the origins of each wine. They give it an age and a location and often some sort of description because there is a clay cap sealing each clay jar, so they can write it on that. So you might get something like, Year 4, sweet wine of the house of Aton, life, prosperity, health of the Western River, chief wine maker, a Perishop. Others give you nice descriptions like this is wine for offerings, this is wine for taxes, and this is wine for merrymaking. You wonder what different qualities they've put into each of those wines. If it's, this is wine for my taxes, I'll put the worst wine into that. Yeah, whereas the wine for merrymaking, keeping that for myself. And speaking of wine for both offerings and merrymaking, there is in ancient Egypt a quite special event. The Festival of Drunkenness. Now, there is a specific beer goddess, Tenanit, but actually the Festival of Drunkenness isn't in her honour, it's in honour of the goddess Hathor. And that's because of a particular story as to how Hathor came into existence. And the story goes that the god Ra looked down upon the earth and was angered by the evils of mankind and by the ingratitude of mankind towards the gods. Ra sends the goddess Sekhmet down to destroy his creation. And Sekhmet goes around from city to city, massacring and destroying everything in sight. And Ra looks down and actually starts to regret this decision. And they're not all that bad. I don't really want to see all of them get smashed to pieces by Sekhmet. What am I going to do? I can't just call her off. So what he does in the story is he dyes a huge quantity of beer red and he drops it in a lake. And Sekhmet goes up to this lake and thinks, it's a lake of blood, lovely, I'll drink that. And apparently is completely unable to tell the difference in taste between blood and beer, and so drinks and drinks and drinks and drinks and falls asleep. And when she wakes up, she is no longer Sekhmet, the devourer and destroyer. She wakes up as Hathor, the goddess of music, laughter, gratitude, and the sky. So she obviously needs a festival in her name. But because the cause for this transformation is beer, it's automatically a festival of drunkenness. And at her cult centre, there's a inscription that the mouth of a perfectly contented man is filled with beer. I don't like the stuff myself, but clearly it worked for them. And in this festival, they have a lot of anointing with oil, a ceremonial barge. They dye a large quantity of beer red, as you would expect, and present it to the goddess. It's unclear whether that's somebody, a priestess dressed up, or whether it's a statue. And then everyone gets really drunk. Everyone gets absolutely plastered in the name of Hathor. There's a priest wandering around filling up all the cups, saying things like, let us drink, let us rejoice, rejoice, rejoice again. Let us become drunk at Hathor's festival of drunkenness. For your soul, drink, become perfectly drunk. And they do. There's also a lot of throwing up, not just because they have drunk a lot of this beer, but sometimes they actually add emetics into the beer. It's supposed to be part of this, just demonstrating how drunk you are and demonstrating how over the top the whole thing is, that you're also throwing up from it, and then you just carry on drinking, which puts a slightly less pleasant image on the fact that this also then turns into an orgy. When they're all very, very drunk, as I say, connection between the boozing and the sex, they are expected to then get at it. And children who are conceived at the festival of Hathor are considered to be very blessed. And you see people mentioning it on their own tombstones and monuments, mentioning that they were a child of that festival. Possibly just because they don't know who their father is. But after all of this frivolity, they fall asleep in the temple where they are, just lying on the ground of the courtyard. And then dawn comes. And a few selected officials who have stayed sober move a big statue of Hathor into the hall, and at dawn they play really loud drums. And everybody is woken with the hideous hangovers, one assumes, to the sound of the drums. And the idea is that they look up and they see Hathor standing over them, lit by the first rays of the rising sun. And at that point, if you can actually remember and articulate what it is you want from your life, the goddess will answer your prayers. I suspect most people's prayers at that point are not the most coherent things, but if you can keep it together enough to say your prayers, then that might work. Not that I'm suggesting this is a way to get your prayers answered in future, but it's interesting to see how different people approach the issue, isn't it? Yeah. If you get horribly drunk, then expect to be woken by lots of loud noises, or expect to wake up having accidentally given away all vestiges of civilization to some woman you've only just met. And on that note, I will bid you farewell. Next week, I think, will be Greeks and Romans and their drinking habits, most likely. Until then, good night unto you all.